You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Richard Smith, an economic historian who's a commentator on China, capitalism, and the environment, and also the author of China's Engine of Environmental Collapse. Good to see you from New York. Dr. Smith, thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, off late, we've seen that China, Beijing, has been a threat, to countries physically on land, on sea, on the sea, in the maritime space, even in space, technology, trade. But on another plane, your central argument is that because of the nature of the beast, if I can put it like that, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP is the leading threat to the environment, and by extension, your argument is over time, life on Earth.
Yes, that's unfortunately true. Yes, right. It's because China's emissions are so huge, more than double those of the US, with a GDP just 63% as large, more than the next 5 largest polluters combined, with a GDP just 28% as large. So it's a huge, their emissions are not just huge, but just so disproportionate in relation to their population, in relation to China's population and its GDP. That's what's so extraordinary, and that's what my book tries to explicate, to try to show why the drivers of China's state-based economy are different than capitalism in the West and capitalism everywhere. But they're both in a race. We're in a global race to eco-suicide, because both economies, both the capitalism and in the Western capitalism and China's bureaucratic collectivist system, are both racing to the cliff to collapse by pumping out so much emissions to maximize growth and economic GDP.
Dr. Smith, so essentially in the current situation with the Chinese economy, it was already slowing down before the pandemic. Now it's recovering. It's most analysts say it's the first to rebound. You are arguing that to meet the CCP set targets, the goals, the economic goals, it's inevitable, and there's no other way that China can actually ramp up to those numbers, but by using highly polluting energy-intensive industries. Is that correctly interpreting what you're saying?
Yes. And the reasons why are because, well, first of all, the reason for growth in China, it's a bit different than capitalism. There are lots of capitalism in China, but the state industries have a different economic imperative, and that is that the Chinese Communist Party, since the revolution, has been in a race to compete with capitalism, and they feel that they need to be number one. They need to have the strongest economy and eventually the strongest military in order to survive against capitalist imperialism. And the failure of the Soviet Union, the failure of the Soviet Communist Party to beat the U.S. in the arms and economic race doomed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And so Xi Jinping, as well, from Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, they have all been concerned to avoid that mistake. And so they're in a race to develop a relatively self-sufficient economy, high-tech economy that can outstrip the U.S. So that's the prime driver of the state economy. Then the capitalist economy, like all the coastal export zones and so forth, they're driven by profit. But the state economy is different. It has a different set of economic imperatives, and those force it to try to maximize self-sufficient economic growth, which means build up the national champions, the national industries like Huawei and so forth, and the China State Railroad and the oil companies and so forth, to make China the leading tech superpower in the world. They want to dominate all the high-tech industries, AI, and so forth, and so that's the driver. Now the problem is, well, how is it that China is also the leading producer of solar power and wind power? It's the leading producer of technologies, and it has the most installed capacity of those. And yet they produce only about 8%. Solar and wind account for only about 8% of electricity in China, which is actually less than in the US, which has a much smaller investment, about a third less. So the question is, well, why is that? And in my book, I explained that there are several reasons, but the main reason is that no one has yet, no country has yet, no economy has yet solved the problem of intermittency with renewable energy. So it's easier for industries to rely on coal or oil or gas or some kind of fossil fuel that runs 24/7. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that in China, you have a very compartmentalized economy, a very particularistic economy, which derives from the formation of the system back in the 1950s. It's very compartmentalized. And so local provinces don't want to share with other provinces. They see other provinces as competitors, local municipalities, local provinces. Every region sees itself, every locality, as an official I quoted in my book says, every locality sees itself as a separate country. Mm-hmm. They compete with each other. And so there's resistance, even though China has built a lot of solar power and a lot of wind power plants. They're mostly in the sunnier and windier regions of China, which tend to be the north and far west and so forth. And so they run power lines to the east, to the heavily populated areas and heavily industrialized areas on the East Coast. But they found that the East Coast provinces and so forth don't want the power from the West. They don't want to buy it. They prefer to have their own coal-fired power plants right there next to them. And in fact, you have a situation in China where it's not uncommon to find large factories with their own power plants. So there can be like power plants every 5 kilometers in Jiangsu province and so forth like that, because it's more rational for local producers to rely on, have their own self-sufficient power plants that they can run all the time, and they don't have to depend on intermittent power from Gansu or Xinjiang or someplace like that. So there are these kinds of pressures within the system that force them to try to grow the economy as fast as possible, so the hyper growth, and force them to rely on fossil fuels more than renewables. So just yesterday, there was a report in Reuters, reported yesterday, day before yesterday, that in the first 6 months of this year, China has built 90% of the world's new coal-fired power plants. Most of the world is getting off of coal, reducing it. India, I think, has just recently You just recently put a hold on a number of coal-fired power plants. Is that right?
Sure. Also opened up to auction to FDI as well, but not Chinese.
Yeah, right. So, the Reuters report said that in the first 6 months of this year, the world fleet of coal-fired power plants has declined by 2.9%, except in China, which is building nearly all the world's new coal-fired power plants. So it's just so crazy, so suicidal to keep building these plants, but that's what they're doing.
To explain that to a layperson, what happens if China continues on that trajectory? And to extrapolate, is there any way to halt that? Or is the only way that there has to be a change in the system, that the Chinese Communist Party has to go?
The sad fact is that in China, with its great firewall, most Chinese are not even aware that their country leads the world in emissions. And even if they were aware, there's nothing they can do about it, because to try to organize anything against the policies of the party state is to invite arrest or worse. So it's very hard to see how this can continue. Personally, I don't think that Xi Jinping can maintain this pattern for very long. I think he's quite desperate. That's why he's so aggressive. And I think he's very fearful that, now he's losing friends all over the world, but he's very fearful of China. He's fearful of unemployment. He's fearful of unrest. He's fearful of all the dissent, and so he's cracking down on everything, on feminists and Marxist students and even Maoist students. The independent effort to create an independent labor union in a factory in Shenzhen. He's desperately afraid, and Hong Kong, of course, is a major threat, because it's like a Berlin. it's China's Berlin. You know, you have this island of comparative freedom and democracy, semi-democracy. It's a huge threat to the Communist Party, and all these protests last year were just, you know, just frightening. So they had to find some way to crack down without invading and massacring people. But we'll see about that in the end. But I think that he's operating on fear, and I really don't think it can go on very long. And what's happening environmentally is that China is suffering tremendously from the global warming that it is in large part, though clearly not all of it. About 30% of the world's emissions are from China. That's not all by any means, but it's the most of any single country. It's against 15% for the US and 9% for the EU and 7% for India and so forth. So it's clearly the leader. But it's facing huge problems of drought and environmental problems.
Floods now.
Yeah, right. All kinds of. So the environmental crisis is hitting China very hard, and will hit it even harder in the upcoming years. So I think that at some point the party's going to crack. I don't think Xi Jinping is going to outlast me, even though I'm 74. I don't think this is going to happen.
Right, but when you look at other countries, developing countries like India, huge developing countries like India, who also have such a huge environmental footprint, there are attempts by the leadership to move to renewables. There's promises of, I think it was about 175 gigawatts, I think, by 2022 for solar energy, and we have little over half on that. But now with the pandemic hitting and all economies trying to revive, one of the ways is by boosting production, and coal production could be one of those, right? So how does India fit into the whole picture?
It is true. It's happening everywhere. I just think the problem for coal is that it's reliable. It's accessible, it's reliable, it's relatively inexpensive, and so it's easy for countries to rely on, but it's just suicidal. We just can't do this. We have to get off coal. That's the worst by far. Natural gas is advertised as a cleaner solution, but it's not really. As someone I quoted it as a natural gas engineer, I quoted in my book said it's not a bridge to renewables. It's a gangplank to suicide. And I think that's right about that, because the leakage and so forth, like in America right now, we have tremendous problems with leakage because the fracking industry has virtually collapsed because demand has collapsed. They've just abandoned these wells, and the wells are leaking methane like crazy all across the Midwest and South where these wells are. So I don't think there's been any major study on that yet. It's just happening, but it's a real disaster in the making, you know. So we just have to get off fossil fuels. We have to get to renewables, and we have to be able to live with the intermittency. And we need to develop world economy that consumes less stuff, consumes fewer resources, less resources. We need to consume less. We need to have a more equal distribution of consumption of resources worldwide for people in India, in America, a whole world. We need to, as environmentalists say, we need to contract and converge our economies so that over-consuming countries in Europe and the US and Japan reduce their consumption of materials and resources, and poorer countries of Africa and Asia can increase their consumption of materials, but not in the capitalist mode, not producing more disposable products and useless gadgets and so forth, but creating a better, what I like to say, a better mode of life for people rather than a higher standard of living, of consumption. So it's that contraction and convergence over the world that we need to do, and live on what renewable energy we can produce. And I don't think that means sacrifice. I mean, I think that means liberation from the treadmill of consumption, and liberation from overconsumption and overpollution.
What do you say to the developing countries' argument about the developed and the historical pollution that has been their responsibility? The US pulling out of the Paris climate change negotiations. I think by the end of the year that will also become formal. The US and the developed countries, how do you see them in this whole picture? And especially, do you deal with that in your book?
I'm afraid I don't in that book.
But you have dealt with it in other writings of yours.
The Green Capitalism book, I do a little bit more, but I have to say that these days I'm just ashamed to be an American. It's just we have such a horrible administration. It's just so ghastly, so anti-humane, and in America and around the world. And I just can't. I just hope we can get rid of this in November and get a better administration, even though it'll still be a capitalist administration and so forth. But nonetheless, the world is on edge. We really do have to change dramatically everywhere, or we'll go extinct. I mean, it's just that's the we're not the first species to go extinct. So I hope we can avoid this, but we really do have to dramatically change our whole approach to our societies, our economic existence.
Dr. Richard Smith, again, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. Okay.
And just a reminder to our viewers, you can get all the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective by logging on to our website, stratnewsglobal.com. You can also follow our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram handles to get the latest analysis and what we're putting up. And just click on that bell icon on our YouTube channel if you want to get reminders for videos like this one that we put up. You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.